Have you ever tested God, or is it even okay to test God? Hi, I'm Farmer Dan, and tonight I want to talk to you about an area that God actually says to test Him. In fact, it's the only time God says to test Him, and that's when it comes to tithing. I think it's really easy to maybe ignore the importance of tithing, especially when things are tight, you're having a hard time paying bills. It's easy to overlook that and think that that's perhaps an area that you can skimp on or maybe even just cut off for a while. But it's actually one area that God says that you could test Him in. And I really believe that as Christians, that needs to be our number one priority when it comes to our finances. I also find it interesting that so many people are trying to figure out how little they can give back. The question will be, well, do I give 10% before taxes or after taxes? Well, scripture says we're to give 10% of the first fruits of our labor. So that means the money that we are making, not the money that we're bringing home. And that should be paid, the tithe should be paid, you know, essentially before the taxes. Now, most of our society is W-2 and it's automatically deducted. But you should really be looking at what your income is for the month, not how much was deposited in your bank account, and give 10% of that. And it's that area that, if you don't believe it or you have a hard time with that, God says test him and see what he'll do. Now, I don't believe that it's always financial blessing that comes along with that obedience to tithing. I think there's many other blessings in life that God can bring our way because of our faithfulness and our obedience to tithe. But do you believe that, I'm speaking to the men here, or perhaps, single mothers, single ladies too? Is it our job to provide for our family or is it God's job? Well, I'm here to say that I believe it's God's job. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have our part in it. There's aspects and principles and things that God, especially for us as men, He's called us to do. He's called us to be the provider and to work hard and to do what we can to take care of our families. We're to protect them. But ultimately, it's God's job. And God's the one that promises to take care of us. And I just need to be faithful in what He's called me to do as a husband and a father and leave the rest up to Him. Is that easy? Not by any stretch of the imagination, not for me. I'm a I'm a planner. I'm a get something done, make things happen kind of a thing. So it can be really hard for me to step back and just trust and allow God to work and provide for my family. We're in a place right now where we've discovered we have mold in our house, and That's probably beyond where it's really feasible to even take care of. And it's an old house that's small. We need a bigger house anyway. But it kills me that my family is living in this environment. Right now, I'm doing what I can. We've bought filtration systems and we plastic off windows, but we're needing to gut the kitchen and we're moving towards getting things set up so that we can do that. But ultimately, we need a house, and it's hard for me. I want to take care of my family and do what's best for them. And it's hard sometimes knowing that I don't feel like I am doing the best or getting them out of an environment that really, I believe is causing some health issues in my wife, potentially health issues in the rest of us. We're just not seeing it maybe as extreme as my wife is. But I have to just sit back and trust and say, okay, God, I know that you're our provider and that you can take better care of my family than I can. Just help me to know what you want me to do and what my responsibility is, and just try to be faithful in that. But ultimately, it's God that's our provider. And I know there's the scripture that talks about taking care of your family, and if you don't, you're worse than an unbeliever. But I believe if we truly believe that God is our provider and that the principles that He has set forth and we're to give the first fruits of our labor and that we can actually test Him in this, I just really believe that even if things are tight and you're having a hard time putting groceries on the table or paying your electric bill or mortgage, that you should still tithe. And it's easy for me to say that because I'm not in that situation. But I really believe that God would come through. And why? Because I've seen Him come through in my life in ways that were completely unexpected. He's provided for us financially. I've heard of other friends and their testimonies of the same thing where they feel led to tithe even though their refrigerator's empty, and go ahead and tithe, and how God has provided where they'll come home from church and find groceries on their front porch, or a friend from church offers to take them out to lunch. And I just really believe in my heart that that's, you know, God cannot lie. So if He says it, you can count on it. You can take it to the bank, so to speak. And it's so interesting to me. Like, it's the only area that God even says testament. So I would challenge you, perhaps if you aren't tithing and things are tough, to go ahead and make that a priority. I believe 10% is what is minimum. It's what was demonstrated in the Old Testament with the Levites and those. That's how they were taken care of. They didn't have jobs. They took 10% of what was offered. I got a chance to meet the daughter of one of the founding members of Vermeer Company. They have some forestry equipment and agricultural equipment. And she said when her dad and her uncle started Vermeer, they believed so much into tithing. As a business, it's interesting that, you can show a profit but still have no money, right? All of my entrepreneurs know what I'm talking about. So they actually borrowed money one year when they were starting out because they had profits but zero money. They borrowed money in order to tithe. That's commitment. That's conviction. And you look at what Vermeer is today, it's an amazing company. They treat their employees so well. They have, I can't remember all the things that they've done, but they would do things like have daycare facilities on the premises or pharmacy, things that just kind of serve their employees better so that they were able to ultimately really serve the company better, but then also be able to serve and have time with their families by having those services in house that just save them time. And Scripture talks about redeeming the time, for the days are evil, and that means buy back your time. Why? Because life is hard. And if you go back to the Strong's Concordance and look at the definition of that, that's what you're going to find. So redeem your time, buy back your time. Why? Because life is hard. And so do what you can to buy back your time. It's your most valuable asset. One of my, I don't know what you'd call, he's not a mentor, never met him, was passed away long before I think I even had heard about it, but it was an inventor in the early 1900s by the name of R.G. LeTourneau. And he invented large equipment to clear land in like the rainforests, I believe. And we got to visit his technical college in Texas when I was growing up, and he made an impact on my life. He was one that tithed or gave back 90% back to God. And that always just really stuck with me. It was, it's backwards. And of course, his philosophy was it's not how much of my money I give back to God, but it's how much of God's money I keep. And I think if we have that perspective, it might help as well when it comes to tithing and making that a priority, because it's not ours anyway. We're just trying to be good stewards and faithful with what he's entrusted to us, which I talked about in my other YouTube channel last week with the talents and being faithful with what God has entrusted to us, both financially and relationships and the skills and talents that he's given us. But that just, as a young man, just really, really made an impact on me. And I bought his autobiography I would have thought that that was a gradual thing. If you started at 10, maybe you go to 20% or 25%, gradually build up. But no, God convicted him and asked him to just go from 10 to 90%. And he was faithful in that. And I understand most of us aren't in that situation, but I can tell you, if God's asking you to do something, the best thing that you can do is be obedient to it. But he was most likely in a different position than the rest of us are. And God asked him to go from 10 to 90%, and he did. And he died with a massive fortune, right? Can't outgive God. And when you're faithful and obedient with what He has called us to do, which I believe is tithing the bare minimum of 10%, watch and see what God will do in your life. Again, I'm not going to promise that it's all financial, but God says test Him. So tell me, do you agree or disagree? If it came down to buying groceries or tithing, what would you choose? Or perhaps you have a testimony that you could share that might encourage others, including myself, how God provided when you were faithful in your giving of your tithe. Let's strike up some conversations. Let's talk. Let's share. Tell me what your thoughts are. So for now, Farmer Dan signing off.